Hi, I'm Jordan Harbour from the Twilight Histories podcast, and I'm excited to introduce Rob Monaco's The Podcast History of Our World. Rob has created a show that to me is the perfect blend of entertainment and good history, and that's why it's become something of an addiction for me. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you subscribe. So without further ado, the show.
Welcome back to the podcast History of Our World. Chapter 40, The Persian Wars, Culmination. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. So read the words on the cenotaph at Thermopylae, marking the last stand of the Spartans, Thebans, and Thespians. It's a testament to their courage that even 2,500 years later, the battle is so prevalent in popular culture. Of course, popular culture also tells us that only 300 Spartans did all the fighting, but one step at a time, I think. I love that this scene from ancient history still captivates the imagination, but what people don't talk about was at the very same moment the Spartan king Leonidas and his men were holding the pass, the Athenian archon Themistocles was with the Greek navy on the task of defending the Straits of Artemisium. Fighting at sea in ancient times was a difficult and dangerous ordeal. Tactics and strategy essentially boiled down into two camps. The Persians preferred utilizing lighter, faster ships for boarding maneuvers. Latch onto an enemy ship, have your archers pepper the deck with arrows, and send in the troops to seize the prize. And while the Greeks did keep some marines on board for this kind of fighting, their main tactic was to employ heavier, sturdier ships with an underwater beak for ramming. The idea is to have the sailors, in unison, build up enough momentum that the trireme smashes into the side of an enemy vessel, puncturing it and sending it to a watery grave. A very effective technique, but this requires a skilled crew, as one out-of-sync rower can start a chain reaction of tangled oars. The Battle of Artemisium would be the first test of Athens' new state-of-the-art triremes, but the crew manning them? Greenhorns through and through. Hopefully their expedited training would be enough to save the day. Commanding the Greek fleet of about 280 was the Spartan Eurybiades. The Athenians made up nearly half that number, but everyone wanted a Spartan commander to lead, and Themistocles knew not to push the issue. That didn't stop him from bribing the Spartan into being more pliable, but hey, backroom politics is as old as the profession itself. The main goal here was to prevent the Persians from reaching Thermopylae and flanking Leonidas. Their numbers were unknown, but if it was anything like their army, then the Greeks had an uphill battle ahead of them. Still, were they not also outnumbered at Marathon? And how'd that turn out? Exactly, they got this. 10 Phoenician ships had been sent to scout out the straits and encountered a token force of 3 Greek triremes stationed there. The Greeks tried to flee but were overtaken and defeated. Oops. The Phoenicians returned to the main fleet and reported how effortlessly they vanquished the enemy. The Persians, no doubt encouraged by this news, moved the fleet closer to the straits before deciding to anchor for the night. It's getting late in the day, and the destruction of the Greeks could wait until tomorrow. Except just like the calamity to befall Mardonius during the first invasion, as if on cue, a powerful storm hit the area. The Greeks, stationed further south, had the good sense to beach their ships ahead of time, but the Persians, with their massive fleet of almost 1,200, couldn't get all of them to the shore in time. Gale force winds and torrential rains tore into the ships, and when it was all over, nearly a third of the fleet had been destroyed. It's terrible, awful luck, no question about it. And if we're going with the 1,200 number, that means that nearly 400 ships sank. And just think of all those people. The distances they traveled just to lose their lives without even seeing combat. It's just terrible. Good thing Xerxes wasn't around to see it, or he might have ordered another chastising of the oceans, and probably beheaded a few captains too, for good measure. Yet even with the storm, the Persians still drastically outnumbered the Greeks. But that doesn't mean they were going to just charge in guns a-blazing. Arrows a-blazing? Whatever. The Persian admiral sends a detachment of 200 ships to travel around the east coast of Euboea and sneak up behind the Greeks. The old pincer move. And keep in mind that even without the ships for this flanking maneuver, the main Persian fleet still outnumbered the Greeks almost 2-1. The first day of actual combat occurred concurrently with the first day of fighting at Thermopylae. The Spartan admiral Eurybiades ordered the ships out to attack, and the Persians engaged, confident that their numbers would be the deciding factor. As the Persians advanced in a wide crescent formation, the Greeks pulled back, grouping their triremes in a circle, bows pointed towards the enemy. Persian tactics dictated boarding procedures, and without a side to latch onto, the ships began circling around the triremes like sharks, looking for a weak spot. And then, taking them by surprise, the Greeks burst out of their circle at full speed, crashing into the Persians and disabling numerous ships. In the chaos of sinking vessels, the Greeks fell back. The Persians did not give chase, and the first day of fighting ended. Oh, and because you can't make this stuff up, there was another storm that night. And guess what happened to the 200 ships off Euboea? You got it, all slammed against the rocky coast and dashed to pieces. So much for that plan. The second day came and was pretty uneventful. A few Persian patrol boats were captured, some reinforcements from Athens arrived, but mostly both sides spent their time repairing the storm damage. Now on the third day of fighting, the Persians gave it all they had. The Greeks countered with the best they could, but clever tricks would not work again. At the end of the day's struggle, both sides had lost nearly 100 ships, but while a drop in the bucket for the Persians, this was a blow to the Greeks. And when the news arrived that Thermopylae had been lost, Eurybiades wasted no time giving the order to retreat. There was no more strategic value in holding Artemisium. They would reconvene at the agreed-upon location at Salamis and go from there. Meanwhile on land, Xerxes and his army moved straight through the Boeotian countryside, the land north of Attica. Many cities submitted like Thebes, with Alexander of Macedon doing the negotiating, but others were not given the chance. Plataea and Thespia are razed to the ground, the first for participating at Marathon, the latter for the delay at Thermopylae. Boeotia was firmly under Xerxes' control, which meant it was only a matter of time before he reached Athens. Now, as you can imagine, the city was in a bit of a panic. Make no mistake, Xerxes was coming. The only question was whether to stay and fight or run away. Themistocles had done his best convincing the city that the only option was to flee to Salamis, but the diehards refused to give in. Athens hadn't fallen to the Dorians, it wouldn't fall to the Persians. However, it was Cimon, son of the dead hero Miltiades, who put an end to the debate. He led a group of wealthy horsemen up to the Acropolis and in front of the temple laid down their bridles, a symbolic gesture basically saying the war will be fought at sea, and let's get the heck out of here. Themistocles quickly gets out a decree to be copied down and read throughout the city with instructions. The city shall be entrusted to Athena and to the other gods for protection and defense against the barbarian. The Athenians in their entirety shall place their children and their women, as well as the elderly and movable property to be deposited at Salamis. The rest of the Athenians who have reached young manhood shall embark on the readied 200 ships, and they shall repulse the barbarian for the sake of liberty, both their own and that of the other Greeks. Aside from some temple workers, priestesses, and those who refused to leave, Athens was evacuated, the refugees being transported to Salamis with the aid of the newly arrived fleet from Artemisium. The great city now faced the wrath of Xerxes. His soldiers arrived to an empty town, save for the defenders holed up on the Acropolis. Within their wooden fortifications, built according to the interpretation of the oracle's wooden wall, they protected the only way up the Acropolis as long as they could, all while Persian archers rained fire arrows down on them. But if you think you can defend a rocky hill from mountain folk, you're gonna have a bad time. The Persians, who had scaled the cliffs of Sardis and forged a path through Thermopylae, climbed the back of the Acropolis, finding a way, as Herodotus puts it, where no guard was, as no one thought anybody could climb that way. The defenders were overwhelmed, some choosing to leap to their death, others retreating to the inner sanctuary of the Temple of Athena. They would end up being massacred. That night, after the temples had been thoroughly looted, Athens was put to the torch. No account survives as to what Xerxes was thinking as he watched the city burn before his eyes. Satisfaction for getting back at the Athenians? Pride in having accomplished what his father couldn't? Or maybe even regret that the city couldn't be spared? Regardless, he sends a messenger back home to Susa to report on his victory. Well, maybe victory is a little premature. Athens might be burned crispy, but the Athenians were very much safe and alive at Salamis. The Greek fleet had been refitted and reinforced by new triremes from other cities and now numbered nearly 375. Oh, and the Spartans had finally mobilized their full army and were ready to give it their all. Now what remained to be seen was where the fight would take place. The Peloponnesian League had just completed defensive structures across the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow entrance to the Peloponnese, and they wanted to dig in there instead of a naval last stand at Salamis. Themistocles had already earned the cooperation of the Spartan commanders through monetary persuasion, but even they were starting to waver. Eurybiades complained that the Olympic Games were starting up again and they should really be there instead of at sea. But Themistocles reminded him of the sacrifices the Athenians had made to keep Greece safe. The Spartans should be ashamed. And when a representative from Eretria tried to speak up, Themistocles let him have it. And what argument can you make about war, you who like the squid have a sword but no heart? He's talking about the quill bone on the squid's body, not actually tiny undersea swords. Which would kind of be awesome. Anyway, his arguments and bribes weren't leading anywhere. It was time for a bit of subterfuge. Under cover of darkness, Themistocles sends out a Persian captive loyal to him, for some reason, with an urgent message for Xerxes. It reads, "Soon as the shades of night descend, the Grecians shall quit their station, rushing to their oars. They mean to separate and in secret flight seek safety." Had the Athenian just sold out the Greeks to the man responsible for burning his beloved city? The message essentially told Xerxes to catch the ships now while they're in disarray, and it'll be like shooting fish in a barrel. The next day, Xerxes held a meeting with his military leaders. It had been about 4 months since they had left from Sardis, and already they had accomplished much. But continuing to supply and feed an army of this size was proving to be a challenging task, and the war needed to end soon. All in favor of just finishing this thing up at Salamis, say aye. Aye. All opposed? Nay. The single dissenter was the tyrant queen of Halicarnassus in southwest Asia Minor, Artemisia. Inheriting the throne after her husband died, she was Xerxes' only female commander, admiral of the fleet from Caria, and the only one urging Xerxes to not attack, instead suggesting starving them out. The Greeks had twice proven that they were dangerous when cornered. Why take unnecessary risks? But though he commended her foresight, Xerxes explained that a naval battle would succeed, because he would be present, observing from a hill. Her piece said she made ready to join her fleet and prepare for what was hoped to be the final offensive. Now in mid-September of 480 BC, the Persian fleet of about 800 moved out. Word reached the Greek commanders, and they were a little scared. Here, picture the geography in your mind. You got Attica on the east side, Salamis on the west, and the straits down the middle. Separating the straits further is an island, thus creating 2 entrances. The Greeks had anchored their ships just northwest of the straits in the narrow crescent-shaped Amphilochia Bay. And these conditions meant that if the Persians go on the offensive, there's nowhere to retreat. But Themistocles had not betrayed his countrymen. His strategy depended on the Persians taking the bait and going on the offense. And that's exactly what they would do. At dawn, Xerxes set up a little observation deck on top of a nearby hill on the Attican side. From there, he could send out communiques to his captains, take down names of which ships performed the best, and record the names of those who failed him. It's like he's playing a really big computer game, only, real people are involved. His fleet spread out, traveling through and blocking both entrances to the bay. In response, the Greek triremes row out in single file, with the Spartans heading out first covering the east flank, then the other Greeks, and then the bulk of the fleet, the Athenians, covering the west flank. As the Persian ships rushed in looking to impress their divine leader, Themistocles gave the order. Well, he told the Spartans to give the order, and the Greeks backed up, forming a U-shape and backpedaling closer and closer and closer to the shore, the Persians chasing after them until finally an old woman watching the ship screamed out, "Madmen, how long are you going to back water?" And then the Greeks exploded out from their position, slamming into the Persian ships with their underwater rams, sending the first wave crashing back into the second wave in a domino effect. In this first attack, a brother to Xerxes and one of 4 admirals in the battle had successfully boarded Themistocles' ship, but was struck down by 2 hoplites and his body tossed into the water. As new Persian ships moved in to engage the Greeks, they became entangled in the mess of splintered masts and shattered hulls, and trying to maneuver or retreat, crashed into yet another wave of oncoming ships, until it became overwhelmingly clear. This had become a complete disaster. Artemisia, who warned this would happen, saw the tide of battle turn, and to avoid being sunk by an Athenian trireme, rammed through a friendly Persian ship to get away. No sense dying for a lost cause. Incidentally, there was another powerful weapon at work here too, although the Greeks may have been unaware of it. Remember, it's not the Persians who were manning the ships. I know I keep calling them Persian ships, but that's only to keep things not confusing. The captains and crew are all Phoenicians, Egyptians, Ionians, Cilicians, seafaring people. The Persians are the soldiers on top for boarding procedures, mountain folk who could scale cliffsides, but didn't know how to swim. And so when their ships went down, the soldiers drowned with them. And if they somehow made it to shore, Greek reservists were standing by to quickly cut them down. Sitting on his throne overlooking the battle, Xerxes saw his plans for Greece vanish beneath the waves. By late afternoon, the fighting was over and the casualties were being counted. The Persians had lost almost 200 ships to the Greeks' 40, not to mention countless sailors and soldiers. In his anger to blame someone for this, he turns his rage on the Phoenician captains. Stupid Phoenicians, they probably lost the battle on purpose. Well, now they'll lose their heads. And he orders the captains executed. The problem here is that the rest of the Phoenicians were horrified at this display, and that night hightailed it back home, taking with them the best ships and sailors in the fleet. And then for good measure, Xerxes received another letter from Themistocles, which basically read like this. Dear Xerxes, how are you? Just letting you know the Greeks were really in the mood last night to go after your ships and burn the Hellespont bridges, which as you might guess would totally strand you here, but I stopped them. Take the hint and scram. With love, Themistocles. Without the bridge, Xerxes would be trapped with his hungry and demoralized army. Not a good situation, and he wisely hightails it up north and back to Sardis by the end of September, early October. Xerxes wouldn't return to Greece, but the war is far from over. The failed general Mardonius had not delivered victory for Darius or Xerxes, but was still granted permission to take an army of about 80,000 to 100,000 to winter in Thessaly. Included were the Immortals, of course, and a force solely comprised of loyal Indo-Aryan troops. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, no treacherous Phoenicians here. These men would lay low and prepare for a renewed assault the following year. But that's in a while from now, and the Greeks have plenty of time to celebrate. There's even great news coming from the west that the tyrants of Sicily defeated the Carthaginians. Time to break out the ouzo. Yes, fortune seems to be smiling on the Greeks, but there's still work to be done. Themistocles, who had won respect for his insistence to defend Salamis, used the downtime to reorganize the army, make repairs to the ships, retake Athens, Mardonius abandoned it on the way up to Thessaly, and most importantly of all, find a way to pay for all this. The easiest solution was to travel to Persian-held Greek islands and demand payment. Charistos and Paros both paid tribute to the Greeks, but it's on Andros that this memorable conversation took place. Themistocles confronted the defenders as to what would happen if they didn't pay. The money will be paid, as we Athenians have two powerful gods on our side, persuasion and necessity. The Andrian response? That's all fine and good, but we Andrians have two useless gods on our side, poverty and helplessness. Cute, but it didn't spare the island from siege and plunder. Meanwhile, yet again, old rivalries and arguments were dividing the Greeks. The Spartans were insisting that with Athens burnt, the best defense was still at the isthmus. The Athenians, of course, strongly disagreed and withdrew their ships from the main Greek fleet. The Spartans then called the Athenians jerkheads and blamed them for starting the war in the first place by burning Sardis. The Athenians called the Spartans ugly and made disparaging remarks about their mothers and how fat they were. This back and forth bickering continued on and off for the next few months, with nothing being accomplished or agreed upon until the spring of 479. Mardonius, perhaps seeing an opportunity to drive a wedge in the Greek political world, calls on Alexander of Macedon to negotiate a deal with the Athenians. In essence, it said, look, you burned our city, we burned yours, come on, we're even now. We're prepared to rebuild all your temples, restore your territory, even permit Athens to operate as a totally autonomous city. Think about how powerful you'd be with the Persian Empire backing you up. And actually, this sounded mighty tempting to the displaced Athenian populace. What had this whole concept of Greek unity got them? The Spartans could care less what happened to them. Maybe it was time for a new strategy. The Athenian elite asked for a night's reprieve to think it over. Tomorrow they'd have a decision. Then they used this time to invite a Spartan delegation to join them, just so they'd hear what Athens was being offered. The Spartans heard the terms and, while no doubt looking quite stoic, were probably very, very nervous at the thought of an Athenian-Persian alliance. But the Athenians smiled at their laconic chums and spoke. "We know as well as you do that the Persians are far stronger than our own. Nonetheless, we cling to our freedom so much that we will offer whatever resistance we can. Tell Mardonius that so long as the sun keeps on its present course, we will never join with Xerxes." Provided, of course, that the Spartans send their army in the Peloponnesian League to retake Boeotia and not wait it out at the Isthmus. And reassuring Alexander that there were no hard feelings between their two nations, the Macedonian king returned to Mardonius to deliver the bad news. Angered at this rejection, Mardonius takes his army to recapture Athens in June of 479, forcing Themistocles to once more evacuate the city. Again, the Persian general offered peace with the Athenians, but again he was denied. So now, instead of simply torching the city, he began to dismantle it, having his troops take it apart brick by brick, stone by stone. This had gone on far enough. The Athenians sent out a desperate request to the Spartans for help, and finally a bit of good news. They were already on their way, led by Pausanias, regent for the slain Leonidas' son, too young to rule. At his command were nearly 5,000 elite Spartan warriors, as well as 35,000 Helot infantry and another nearly 30,000 hoplites from the Peloponnesian allies. Once Athens brought in her own troops, the Greek army stood at nearly 80,000, the largest combined fighting force ever seen in the Greek world and almost equal in size to the Persians. When news of Sparta's advance reached Mardonius, he fled from Athens to Thebes, which, if you recall, had gone over to the Persians, and had terrain better suited for cavalry. He set up his forces near the burned remains of Plataea, behind the Asopos River, and waited for the Greeks to make the first move. Except the Greeks were comfortable on the high ground they chose south of the river, and they weren't going anywhere. Impatient, Mardonius attacks, sending his horsemen out onto the Greek flanks. However, in this charge, the Persian cavalry commander was killed, thanks to a unit of Athenian archers, a weapon not normally used or liked by the Greeks. After a few more days of waiting for the other side to flinch, or for better omens, Mardonius couldn't afford to keep delaying the attack. Yet instead of going after the soldiers, he sent his remaining cavalry around the back to attack the Greek supply lines. At night, the raiding party rode out, destroying a convoy laden with food and poisoning the springs from which the Greeks were getting their water. The next day brought panic and concern for the Hellenic allies. It was now August, and fighting under the hot sun without water was like signing your own death warrant. To prevent another raid on their supply lines, the Greeks sought to retreat closer to Plataea, where they could better defend the shipments. That night, while it was safer, the center force of the Greeks, mostly from the smaller cities, pulled back, leaving the right wing of the Spartans and the left wing of the Athenians to hold the line in case of attack. However, in the dark, the center line got lost and retreated too far. The Athenians were next up, but they waited too long for the center line to clear before they moved. So as the sun rose, the Athenians had not yet finished pulling back, and the Spartans hadn't even started. Worried at the fragile state of his army, Pausanias leaves a token division of hoplites to buy them time. Now, if we zoom out for a bird's-eye view of the map, picture a river running horizontally with a tributary running down the right side. To the north were the Persians, lined up in attack formation. To the south, you got the Athenians hanging on to the west, the other cities disarrayed in the far south, and the Spartans hugging the tributary to the east. It was a mess. And Mardonius believed that the Greeks had finally caved into their political squabbles and fractured apart. The time has come to strike. At daylight on the 13th day since the armies had met outside the ruins of Plataea, the Persians attacked. Mardonius led the bulk of his forces towards the Spartan position. They were the most dangerous, after all, and harassed them with cavalry until the infantry got closer. Once in position, the Persian soldiers planted their wicker shields firmly in the ground and opened fire, launching wave after wave of arrows onto the Spartans. They were pinned down. Pausanias and his men bravely withstood the barrage, but kept hope that the Athenians would come to their aid. This was not to be, however, as the Athenian hoplites were up against the turncoat Thebans, fighting in the deadly phalanx formation. Perhaps realizing that they were on their own, the Spartans did what any rational people would do under a rain of arrows. They charged, racing towards the Persian infantry, colliding into them with their massive shields. Such was the ferocity of this attack that the Persians resorted to grabbing the Spartan spears away from them to sort of neuter the phalanx. But without their spears, the Spartans moved next to the short swords at their side and kept up the attack. Except now they were vulnerable to mounted troops who had just re-entered the battle. Leading this new charge was Mardonius himself, perhaps in a play to win favor back home for this valor in battle. He would not live to see it. Upon recognizing the Persian general, who was riding an unmistakable white horse, one of the Spartan soldiers grabbed a large rock and hurled it directly at him, striking his head, killing him instantly. With their general dead, the Persians' morale broke, and they flee from battle. Some simply run as far as they can, while about 3,000 sought safety within the walls of their camp north of the river. By this time, the Athenians had broken the Theban phalanx, and they marched to join up with the Spartans. The other Greeks who had fled too far had also finally caught up and joined in the siege of the camp. Once the walls were breached, it was a slaughter. No Persian was left alive. The dust settled, and the battle was over. The Greeks had done it again. They stood victorious over a numerically superior imperial army. Investigating the camp, the Spartan commander Pausanias found Mardonius' opulent headquarters, decorated in gold and silver, with a full banquet feast already prepared. He laughed and called for the other Greek generals. "I sent for you, O Greeks, to show you this folly. How far the Persians traveled to rob us of our poverty." How very Spartan. Pausanias orders the Helots to strip the camp of all the booty and loot they could find and deposit it in a giant pile to be distributed to the men. 10% went to the oracle at Delphi, well, Apollo, but she gets the treasure as his agent. And much of the bronze weaponry would be melted down to form a large column of 3 intertwining snakes, with the cities who participated in battle inscribed on it. The Serpent's Column, as it's called, still exists, in a reduced form, and stands in the Hippodrome of Constantine in Istanbul today. At the same time the Battle of Plataea was going on, another simultaneous battle took place. Under the other Spartan king, the Greek fleet pursued the Persian ships to Samos on the Ionian coast. The Persians, however, decided to beach their ships and build a wooden wall around them, choosing to fight the Greeks on land. Well, how could a Spartan refuse? Even though each Greek trireme carried no more than 30 hoplites, they disembarked, meeting the Persian garrison at the shore. The defenders, thinking they had the numerical advantage, charged at the Greeks, but the hoplites once again proved their mettle and soundly trounced them. The Persian camp was looted, taken apart, and the ships were burned. On their way back home, the Greeks made a detour up to the Hellespont to actually get around to destroying that bridge, but it turned out someone beat them to it. No one knows for sure who did. Greek saboteurs? Persians looking to cover their tracks? Regardless, the bridge was dismantled even further, with the Athenians carrying off the massive flax and linen cables back home as a trophy. And so ends the second Persian invasion of Greece. The Greeks learned to cooperate long enough to hold off a massive invasion, and with some excellent military strategy and tactics, stood supreme. That'll teach those Imperials not to come knocking around anymore. I bet they're still fuming over their loss, nursing their wounds, and crying like little baby men. Well, not exactly. Yeah, they lost the war, but so what? The Persian Empire is still ridiculously huge and wealthy, and Xerxes is still king of kings. He spends the next 14 or so years launching building projects and generally enjoying his luxurious lifestyle, until he's assassinated in 465 by his chief bodyguard, who in turn is killed by Artaxerxes, his son. Over in Greece, it's mostly mop-up time, getting rid of any Persian stragglers, punishing Greek cities that switch sides, we're looking at you, Thebes, and more or less getting back to normal. As for the Athenians, however, normal was a long ways away. Their beloved city lay in ruin. Homes, temples, all smashed to pieces, scorch marks blotting the landscape. Where do you even go from there? And that's what we'll hear about next time, as we follow up on the Athenians post-war. Without a common enemy to unite against, would the Greeks turn on each other? And what about Sparta? They're coming out of this pretty well off. Would the destruction of Athens shift the balance of power to the Peloponnese? Well, not if Themistocles has anything to say about it. It's Reconstruction time on the podcast history of our world.